So I'm gonna be honest, I too occasionally get the craving for some American Chinese takeout food, just like everybody else. And my go-to is General Tso's chicken, or if you want to be correct about it, General Tso. But depending on where you go, it tends to be hit or miss. It can be drenched in sauce, the breading could be soggy. So I decided to take it upon myself to see if I could make it at home so that at least I can be consistent with the way I'm making it and I know what goes into it. And beyond that, in thinking about this, I got curious about the origins of General Tso chicken. I too have seen the documentary and I know of its purported inventor, Chef Peng, but I've never tried the original and neither have a lot of Americans, so I figured I'd try and make that as well and see what the differences are. So starting with the classic American version, I'm going to take some whole chicken legs, remove the skin, and fillet them by slicing down the length and removing the bones. Once that's done, I'll slightly tenderize it by lightly pounding it with the blade of my knife. This puts little tiny cuts along the length of it, which will also help it soak up the marinade. And then I'll cut this into bite-sized pieces. Now for the marinade, I'm going to throw that into a bowl. I'm going to season that with a pinch of salt, a few cracks of white pepper, about a half a teaspoon of MSG, a tablespoon of Shaoxing wine, 2 egg whites. I'm using egg whites here because that'll supposedly make things more crispy than if you use the yolks as well. Half a teaspoon of baking soda. This should make the batter light and fluffy, which in hindsight is actually not what I want. I want crispy batter, but we'll see if we get that out of this anyway. And now I'm going to add in cornstarch and mix everything together, adding more cornstarch or a little bit of water as necessary until you get the consistency of pancake batter. And a little drizzle of oil. Now we can go ahead and set that aside for about 30 minutes while we work on Chef Peng's version. So the main difference here is we're going to leave the skin on the chicken legs, but same process from there. We'll debone and fillet those legs as well, and cut them into tiny little morsels. Now for the marinade, I'm following what is purported to be the original Chef Peng's recipe that I found on Taiwan News, and it's a bit weird. I think they blur the lines between the sauce and the marinade here, so there's a lot of extra ingredients here, but we'll see how it turns out. So I'll season the chicken with salt, 1 whole egg, tablespoon of soy sauce, tablespoon of white vinegar, a couple tablespoons of chicken stock, a teaspoon of sugar, half a teaspoon of MSG, and a tablespoon of cornstarch. And I'll go ahead and mix that all together and set it aside for half an hour as well. Alright, once those are done marinating, I'm going to fill my wok with a few cups of oil and bring it up to temperature over medium-high heat. And now piece by piece, I'll add in Peng's chicken, working in batches so the wok doesn't get too full. Using my spider, I stirred that around so the pieces didn't stick together, and occasionally pulled it out of the oil to check on how crispy it was getting, and because that's what the recipe said to do. This is supposedly the technique that they use at Peng's Garden restaurant in Taiwan. And once it was looking good and golden, I scooped it out entirely and set it aside to rest for a few minutes before popping it in for a second fry. The recipe didn't call for a second fry, but the fact that the batter was so runny, it didn't really stick to the chicken, and things didn't really get crispy. The skin was kind of floppy, so I just wanted to get this extra crispy if I could. And even after that second fry, things were not looking very crispy. So at this point, I was just trying to save this batch of chicken. So I put it into a second batch of the same marinade, but this time used more cornstarch to thicken things up and hopefully crisp them up on the outside. Which kind of worked, but it kind of turned out a little bit weird and patchy looking, and it still didn't get quite crispy. So So I checked a few other Taiwanese recipes, and it seems like I was right. Instead of mixing the entire sauce and marinade together, really you should just do a simple marinade of some salt, some white pepper, some cornstarch, and an egg. Mix that all together and set it aside. And then right before frying, I'm gonna dredge it in some cornstarch. That'll coat the outside with a layer of cornstarch that will get nice and crispy. So again, I'll fry that twice. And this time things got a lot crispier, a lot more golden. So I was set to move on with the American style. Now, since this one had the proper batter from the start, it fried up a little bit better and ended up with a nice crispy exterior. So at this point, we're ready to drain the oil, and you can save that for later. Once all the cornstarch settles out of it, you can sort of separate it and reuse it later on. I'm gonna quickly clean my wok, heat up a few tablespoons of oil over high heat, and then I'll add in 5 or 6 cloves of minced garlic. And pounding it like this with the side of your knife is a quick and easy way to remove the paper, as well as to cut the mincing time in half, basically. It's already broken down into small little pieces. An equal amount of minced ginger, which can be easily peeled with a spoon. Honestly, it's much faster than trying to pare it with your knife. And again, smashing this with the side of your knife makes the work a lot easier. And some dried chili peppers that I've cracked into segments. You can use a lot or a little here. The original recipe is from a Hunanese chef. Even though he lived in Taiwan, he was from Hunan, which is known for their use of chilies. So use your own discretion. And once those are good and aromatic and you start sneezing from the chili peppers, we're gonna add in Chef Peng's sauce, which consists of a tablespoon of soy sauce, a tablespoon of black vinegar, a teaspoon of salt, a teaspoon of sugar, half a teaspoon of MSG, and about a tablespoon of cornstarch, a couple tablespoons of chicken stock. Mix that up and dump it in. And I'm gonna cook this down for a few minutes until it thickens. And once it's looking nice and thick, I will add in the chicken. Give it a good mix until every piece is coated. And that one's ready to plate. Now we'll go ahead with the American version. So same thing, a few cloves of minced garlic and an equal amount of ginger into a hot wok with some chili peppers. The American version isn't usually actually spicy, but I would prefer if it was spicy, so I'm just adding a good amount of chili peppers here. And now the American sauce is a bit more involved. I'm gonna put in about 125 milliliters of chicken stock, a tablespoon of soy sauce, a tablespoon of dark soy sauce for color, a couple tablespoons of Shaoxing wine, a tablespoon of oyster sauce, a tablespoon of ketchup, a half a cup or about 125 milliliters of sugar. It sounds like a lot, but it's actually a lot less than what they use in the restaurants, so keep that in mind. A tablespoon of white vinegar, and of course a nice pinch of MSG. I'll dump that into the wok. And at this point I want to add in a cornstarch slurry. That's about a 2-to-1 ratio of cornstarch to water. You can go pretty light on this because cornstarch actually works really effectively to thicken up sauces. As you'll see, I added maybe 2 tablespoons of that slurry, and almost immediately it thickens right on up. At which point I can add in my chicken, give it a good toss, and plate it on up. Alright, now the American version is what I have come to expect from a lot of Chinese restaurants. It's sweet, it's tangy, it's garlicky, and my version is pretty spicy, which balances things out quite nicely. So I've got the sauce pretty locked down. One thing I would change about the chicken though is the breading. It is not as crispy as I would like it. It's just kind of doughy, it's a little bit heavy, not really what I'm looking for in some good fried chicken. So I think if I would go back and make this again, I would use my Korean fried chicken breading method, which will be extra crispy, and I think it'll go really well with this sauce. Now, as for Peng's version, it's not entirely different. I can see what people are saying when they say that a whole bunch of sugar was added to the American version, because the flavor profile here is really just garlicky, vinegary, spicy, and soy-based. It's really interesting and good in its own right, and I feel like this should be served in a totally different way than the takeout version. I think this would go really well as part of a bigger meal, since it does have such a powerful flavor. You know, I think it's meant to be a rice killer, whereas General Tso's, the sugar really balances out the acidity in a nice way that I also appreciate. I think that's the reason why it's one of the most famous American Chinese dishes, is it's so well balanced that it just doesn't really need anything on the side, except for maybe some wilted broccoli and some pork fried rice.